George. I grew up in Washington, D.C. Did I or anyone so situated give much thought to the man for whom our city was named? Hardly. The Washington Monument, even for me at the age of 10, was of world-class boredom. Mount Vernon on the Potomac was interesting, particularly George's clothes, lovingly displayed. He was a giant with large hands, feet, and a huge rump. Also, a formidable poitrain due to some sort of syndrome which rendered him Amazonian in appearance and childless, mule-like, for life. But he was a man of great dignity and strength, and once, when he ordered 2 soldiers to stop a fight, and they went right on, he picked each up by the scruff of the neck and banged the 2 heads together. Very satisfying. Plainly a dominatrix of the old-fashioned sort. A condition of my admission to St. Albans, a local school, was that I read a biography of Washington. I, who could even then read almost anything, was desolate. George Washington. The syllables of that name had the same effect on me that Gerald Ford now does. But I finally got through what was a standard hagiography of the sort that every nation inflicts upon its young in order to make them so patriotic that they will go fight in wars not of their choosing while paying taxes for the privilege. Pre-Watergate, to get people to do such things, it used to be necessary to convince the innocent that only good and wise men, no women then, governed us. Plaster of Paris demigods given to booming out at intervals awful one-liners like, "Give me liberty or give me death." Thus were we given the liberty to pay our taxes, though it might have been nice to have had the freedom to use for the public good some of the money taken from us. A long time has passed since my school days and my first encounter with George. Currently incomes are down, taxes are up. Empire has worn us out and left the people at large broke. In the process, we ceased to have a representative government. In 1996, 51% of those qualified to vote chose not to vote for president. President Clinton was reelected by 49% of the voters, a minus mandate, to put it mildly. And so, George, where are you now when we need you? To which the answer is, which George do you have in mind? Bush or? The real George Washington, to the extent that we can reconstruct him, was born in 1732 and died in 1799, younger at death than the crotchety Bob Dole was in the late election. When George was 11, his father died, and he was brought up by his half-brother Lawrence, who had married into the Fairfax family, one of the richest in Virginia. It was Lawrence who owned the fine estate on the Potomac River, Mount Vernon. As George was not much of one for books in school, he became a surveyor at 15. He was also land mad, and so, while surveying vast properties, he started investing every penny he could get his hands on in land, some of it crucially along the Ohio River. Meanwhile, the Grim Reaper was looking out for George. Lawrence and his daughter both died when George was 20, making him the master of Mount Vernon. Now very rich, but never rich enough, he took up soldiering. The colonial governor of Virginia sent him to the Ohio Valley, near today's Pittsburgh, with orders to drive the French from American territory. And so in 1754, the first of George's numerous military defeats was inflicted upon him by the French. With characteristic Gaelic panache, they sent him back home, where he was promptly promoted to colonel. But then anyone destined to have his likeness carved on a mountainside can only fall upward. In 1758, George was elected to the Virginia legislature, the House of Burgesses. The next year he married a very rich widow, Martha Dandridge Custis. George was now, reputedly, the first American millionaire. Georgian Revolution. As George looked like a general, the unpleasantness near Pittsburgh was overlooked. The Second Continental Congress, in a compromise between Massachusetts and Virginia, chose him to be commander-in-chief of the new Continental Army, whose task it was to free the 13 American colonies from England. "No taxation without representation," was the war cry of the rebelling colonists, just as it is of the Reverend Jesse Jackson and close to 1 million disenfranchised blacks in Georgia's city today. A far less accomplished general than Ethan Allen or Benedict Arnold, George did know how to use them well. In 1775, although Boston and New York were in British hands, George sent an army north to conquer Canada. Canada has always been very much on the minds of those Americans inclined to symmetry. When the White House and Capitol were put to the torch in 1814, and President Madison fled into the neighboring woods, where was the American army? Invading Canada yet again. The dream. The impossible dream. George moved south to New York, where he managed to lose both Long Island and Manhattan to the British, who remained comfortably in residence until the French fleet came to George's aid in October 1781. And the British, now bored, bad-tempered, and broke, gave up the colonies. In a moving ceremony, George took over New York City, and as the British flag came down and our flag went up, there was not a dry eye to be seen, particularly when the American soldier, shimmying up the flagpole to hoist New Glory, suddenly fell with a crash at George's feet. The treacherous Brits had greased the pole. George went home. He was a world figure. The loose confederation of independent states was now beacon to the world. George farmed. He also invented a plow, so heavy that no ox could pull it. He was grimly competing with crafty fellow farmer Jefferson, who had invented the dumbwaiter. Never an idle moment for the founding dads. Then something happened. Captain Daniel Shays of Massachusetts, a brave officer in the Revolution, had fallen on hard times. Indeed, most of the veterans of the war were suffering from too little income and too many taxes. They had been better off before independence, they declared, and so Shays and his neighbors, in effect, declared war on Massachusetts in 1786, when Shays and several hundred armed veterans marched on the state arsenal at Springfield. Although his impromptu army was soon defeated, Shays' rebellion scared George to death. He sent agonized letters to various magnates in different states. To Harry Lee. "You talk of employing influence to appease the present tumults in Massachusetts. I know not where that influence is to be found, or, if attainable, that it would be a proper remedy for the disorders. Influence is no government. Let us have one by which our lives, liberties, and properties will be secured, or let us know the worst at once." There it is, the principle on which the actual American Republic was founded, erasing in the process Thomas Jefferson's astonishing and radical proposal that along with life and liberty, the citizen has the right to pursue happiness and even, with rare luck, overtake it. George was too hard-headed for that sort of sentimentality. George knew that property must always come first, and so in due course he got the republic that he wanted, a stern contraption set in place to ensure the safety and property of the prosperous few. After 2 terms as president, with Alexander Hamilton acting as prime minister, George went home to Mount Vernon in 1796, mission accomplished. Although Madison and Mason, with Jefferson back of them, came up with the mitigating Bill of Rights, that bill has never won many American hearts. After the Civil War, the 14th Amendment made it clear that the rights for United States persons also applied to each citizen as a resident within his home state. The Supreme Court, always Georgian save for the Earl Warren lapse in the 60s, promptly interpreted those rights as essentially applicable to corporations. And so in death, George won again. The man? George was dignity personified. The impish Governor Morris was bet $10 that he wouldn't dare go up to Washington at one of Lady, they called her that, Washington's levees, and put his hand on George's shoulder. Morris did, collected his bet, then said, "I don't think that I shall do this a second time." In his last address as president, George warned against foreign adventures and also permanent alliances with foreign nations, while as rarely as possible trusting to temporary alliances for extraordinary emergencies. In his worst nightmares, George could never have dreamed of just how many extraordinary emergencies his 40-odd successors would be able to cook up. George and posterity? He is ever present in our decaying institutions. Iconography? The movies have generally ignored him, while his biographies tend to be dull because the biographers are too busy defending his principles while pretending that we live, or are supposed to live, in a democracy, an absolute non-starter from the beginning. George today? A year or two ago, a wealthy friend, so rich that he never handles actual cash, picked up a dollar bill that someone had left on a table and said, with wonder, "When did George Bush put Barbara's picture on the money?" Barbara Bush and George are look-alikes. In the end, as it was at the beginning, it is all about money, as George knew from the start.